The grey morning mist hung over Ashworth Manor like a veil of judgment as Lady Isabel Montclair stood in the grand foyer, her hands bound with coarse rope that chafed against her delicate wrists. The accusations rang in her ears like funeral bells: theft, betrayal, disgrace. Around her, the household staff whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and condemnation that cut deeper than any blade. "Remove her from my sight," Duke Alexander Ashworth commanded from the top of the marble staircase, his voice as cold as the February wind that rattled the manor's ancient windows. His steel-grey eyes held no mercy, no trace of the warmth that had once made Isabel's heart flutter like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. "Take her to the magistrate. Let justice be served." Isabel lifted her chin with the pride that had sustained her through 23 years of life, though her heart shattered like crystal against stone. She had known this moment would come eventually. The missing silver, the depleted pantry stores, the unexplained absences from the manor, all had painted a picture of guilt that no protestations of innocence could erase. Yet she would not reveal the truth. Some secrets were worth more than reputation, more precious than freedom itself. "Your Grace," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her soul, "I understand your anger. I ask only that you remember me as I was, not as these circumstances have painted me to be." Alexander's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his perfectly shaved cheek. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of the man who had once laughed with her in the rose garden, who had taught her to waltz in the moonlight streaming through the ballroom's tall windows. But the moment passed like smoke on the wind, and his expression hardened once more into aristocratic disdain. "I knew you when you were pure, Lady Montclair. This version of you is a stranger to me." His words fell like hammer blows upon her already wounded heart. "Mrs. Henderson, see that she is escorted from the premises immediately." The housekeeper, a stern woman with iron-grey hair and eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. Margaret Henderson had been like a mother to Isabel since her arrival at Ashworth Manor 6 months ago, offering guidance and protection to the young woman whose own family had cast her out for refusing an arranged marriage to a man 3 times her age. "Come, child," Mrs. Henderson murmured, her weathered hand gentle on Isabel's elbow. "Best we get this over with quickly." As they moved toward the heavy oak doors, Isabel caught sight of her reflection in the polished silver mirror that hung in the foyer. The woman staring back was a ghost of her former self, hollow-cheeked from missed meals, her once lustrous auburn hair now dull and lifeless, her green eyes shadowed with exhaustion and secrets too heavy for one person to bear. The elegant morning dress she wore, borrowed from the Duchess's own wardrobe, seemed to mock her current circumstances. The journey to the village magistrate's office passed in a blur of accusing stares and whispered conversations. Word of her alleged crimes had spread through the county like wildfire, and everywhere Isabel looked, she saw faces twisted with disappointment and betrayal. These were people who had welcomed her into their community, who had danced at the harvest festival and shared stories by the pub's warm fireplace. Now they looked upon her as they would a common criminal. Magistrate William Thornfield was a man whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his distaste for the wealthy elite who thought themselves above the law. His office smelled of old leather and pipe tobacco, the walls lined with law books that promised justice but too often delivered only the illusion of it. He studied the evidence before him with methodical precision, a detailed inventory of missing items from Ashworth Manor, witness statements from the household staff, and a character reference from Duke Alexander himself that painted Isabel as a woman of questionable morals who had taken advantage of his family's hospitality. "Lady Montclair," Magistrate Thornfield said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent dispensing judgment. "You stand accused of theft of property valued at over £50, a crime punishable by transportation to the colonies or imprisonment with hard labour. How do you answer these charges?" Isabel met his gaze steadily, though her hands trembled in her lap. "I confess that items from Ashworth Manor came into my possession, Magistrate Thornfield. However, the circumstances surrounding these actions are far more complex than a simple charge of theft would suggest." "Then explain yourself, child. Make me understand why a lady of your breeding would resort to such desperate measures." For a moment, Isabel wavered. The truth burned on her tongue like acid, begging to be released. She could tell them about the children, about the faces that haunted her dreams and drove her to risk everything she held dear. She could speak of tiny hands reaching for scraps of bread, of fevered brows that she had cooled with stolen medicines, of hope kindled in eyes that had known only abandonment and despair. But to do so would expose them to scrutiny, would bring unwanted attention to those who deserved protection above all else. "I cannot provide the explanation you seek," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can only ask for your mercy and assure you that my actions, while technically criminal, were motivated by compassion rather than greed." Magistrate Thornfield leaned back in his chair, studying her with eyes that had learned to read the truth in human faces. "You protect someone, don't you? Someone whose safety means more to you than your own freedom." Tears gathered in Isabel's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I protect what I must, sir. Nothing more, nothing less." The magistrate was silent for a long moment, the scratching of his quill the only sound in the small chamber as he recorded her plea. Finally, he set down his pen and folded his hands before him. "Given the value of the stolen goods and your refusal to provide mitigating circumstances, I have no choice but to sentence you to 6 months of imprisonment with hard labour, to be served in His Majesty's correctional facility. However," he paused, his expression softening almost imperceptibly, "I am willing to delay the execution of this sentence for 48 hours, should new evidence come to light that might alter the circumstances of this case." As the constables led her away to the holding cells, Isabel caught one last glimpse of the grey sky through the small window. Somewhere out there, in the abandoned mill on the outskirts of the village, 12 children waited for her return. They would wait through the cold night, their empty stomachs growling, their thin blankets providing little comfort against the bitter winter wind. By morning, they would understand that she was never coming back. The iron door clanged shut behind her with the finality of a tomb. Isabel sank onto the narrow cot, her elegant dress incongruous in the damp, stone-walled cell. She had saved them for as long as she could, those forgotten souls that society had discarded like yesterday's newspaper. Now they would face the winter alone, and she would carry the weight of that knowledge to whatever fate awaited her. In 48 hours, her life as she knew it would be over. But in the darkness of her cell, she found a strange peace in knowing that her sacrifice had meaning, that love could triumph over law even when justice seemed impossible to achieve. 36 hours had passed since Lady Isabel Montclair's arrest, and Duke Alexander Ashworth found no satisfaction in his victory. He stood in his study, staring out at the winter landscape that stretched endlessly beyond his estate, yet the view that once brought him peace now seemed as cold and barren as his own heart. The brandy in his crystal tumbler had long since grown warm, untouched, despite his desperate need for something to dull the ache that had settled in his chest like a physical wound. Sleep had eluded him completely. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Isabel's face as the constables led her away. The quiet dignity with which she had accepted her fate, the way her green eyes had held his for one last moment before she disappeared through the magistrate's door. There had been no pleading, no theatrical protestations of innocence, only a resignation that somehow made him feel like the criminal in this sordid affair. "Your Grace." Mrs. Henderson's voice interrupted his brooding, her tone more formal than it had been in the 6 months since Isabel's arrival had brought unexpected warmth to the usually austere household. "Forgive the intrusion, but young Timothy Fletcher is here to see you. He says it's urgent." Alexander frowned, setting down his untouched brandy. Timothy Fletcher was barely 14, one of the village boys who occasionally ran errands for the manor in exchange for a few coins and a hot meal. What could possibly be so urgent that the child would brave the February cold to seek an audience with the Duke himself? "Send him in, Mrs. Henderson, and perhaps bring him something warm to drink. The boy looks half frozen." Timothy entered the study with the awkward gait of someone unaccustomed to walking on polished marble floors. His clothes were patched and threadbare, his boots worn so thin that Alexander could see his toes through the holes. But it was the boy's eyes that captured the Duke's attention, wide and desperate with the kind of fear that came from witnessing something terrible. "Your Grace," Timothy stammered, his voice cracking with emotion and adolescence. "I heard about Lady Isabel, about what they're saying she done. But it ain't true at all." Alexander studied the boy carefully, noting the way his hands shook and how he kept glancing toward the door as if planning an escape. "What do you know of Lady Montclair's affairs, Timothy? Speak plainly." "She weren't stealing for herself, Your Grace. She was saving us. All of us." The words tumbled out like water from a broken dam. "The little ones at the old mill, they was dying before she came. Dying of cold and hunger and sickness, and nobody cared because we ain't got no families what matter to fine folk like yourself." The confession hit Alexander like a physical blow. "What mill? What children? Explain yourself clearly, boy." Timothy's courage seemed to gather strength as he spoke, his young voice growing steadier with each word. "The abandoned flour mill past Widow Hartley's cottage. Been empty for years, since old Mr. Grimsby died and his son moved to London. We've been living there, me and 11 others. Orphans mostly, some what ran away from workhouses what treated them worse than animals." Alexander sank into his leather chair, his mind reeling with implications he had never considered. "How long have you been living there?" "Near on 2 years now, Your Grace. We made do as best we could, picking berries in summer, taking odd jobs when folks would have us, but winter—" Timothy's voice broke, and he wiped his nose with the back of his sleeve. "Winter was killing us one by one. Little Mary went first, coughing up blood till she couldn't breathe no more. Then James, not even 7 years old, froze to death in his sleep one January night." The room fell silent, except for the crackling of logs in the fireplace, a warmth that suddenly seemed obscene in light of Timothy's revelations. Alexander thought of his own childhood, spent in comfort and luxury, never knowing the bite of true hunger or the terror of sleeping without shelter. The contrast was almost too painful to bear. "When did Lady Montclair find you?" Alexander asked quietly. "Late summer it were, just after harvest time. She were out riding that pretty mare of hers when she heard baby Emma crying. Emma's just 3, you see, and she weren't doing well without proper food." Timothy's eyes brightened with the memory. "Lady Isabel, she took one look at us and started crying herself. Said no child should live like that, not in England, not anywhere. And so she began taking supplies from my household," Alexander said, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place with devastating clarity. "She saved us, Your Grace. Every week she'd come with food and medicine, sometimes blankets or clothes what she said weren't needed at the manor. She never took nothing for herself, not ever. Half the time she looked hungrier than we did. She were giving us her own portions." Timothy stepped closer to the desk, his young face earnest with desperate hope. "She made little Sarah's fever break with medicine from your own physician's bag. She taught Robert his letters so he might make something of himself someday. She held baby Emma when the nightmares came, singing lullabies in that pretty voice of hers. Alexander's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. The woman he had condemned as a thief had been performing acts of charity that put his own Christian duty to shame. While he had lived in comfort, surrounded by more wealth than he could spend in 3 lifetimes, children had been dying of starvation within walking distance of his gates. And when Isabel had tried to remedy this unconscionable situation, he had branded her a criminal and destroyed her reputation without bothering to seek the truth. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. He had given her no reason to trust him with such a vulnerable secret, no indication that he would value human compassion over property rights. "She were afraid, Your Grace. Afraid you'd make us go back to the workhouses or split us up among different parishes. We're a family now, you see. All we got is each other." Timothy's voice grew thick with unshed tears. "She said some folk don't understand that poor children got just as much right to love and protection as rich ones do." The truth of those words cut through Alexander like a sword. He had been exactly the kind of man Isabel had feared, more concerned with the inventory of his silver than the welfare of the innocent. His own moral blindness had led him to punish the one person who had been trying to live according to the Christian principles he claimed to follow. "Where are they now, Timothy, the other children?" "Still at the mill, Your Grace, cold and scared, and wondering why Lady Isabel ain't come back like she promised." The boy's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down his dirt-stained cheeks. "Little Emma keeps asking when the pretty lady's coming back with more stories. I don't know what to tell her." Alexander stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. "Mrs. Henderson," he called, his voice echoing through the manor with an urgency that brought the housekeeper running. "Your Grace? What's wrong?" "Prepare a wagon with food, blankets, and medical supplies. Enough for 12 children for at least a fortnight. And send word to Dr. Whitmore immediately. Tell him his services are needed at the old Grimsby Mill." He turned to Timothy, who was staring at him with wide, hopeful eyes. "You'll guide me there, boy. It's time I met the children that Lady Montclair risked everything to save." As Timothy nodded eagerly, Alexander felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the iron bands that had constricted his heart since childhood. For the first time in years, he was about to do something that mattered, something that had nothing to do with profit margins or social standing, and everything to do with simple human decency. The woman he had wronged was still sitting in a cell, facing a sentence that would destroy her future. But perhaps, if he acted quickly enough, he could still salvage something from the wreckage of his own moral failings. Perhaps there was still time to prove himself worthy of the love she had shown to those forgotten children. The Duke was about to discover that redemption, like love, sometimes came disguised as the very thing you thought you wanted to destroy. Don't miss the powerful conclusion to this tale of love, sacrifice, and redemption that will restore your faith in the triumph of compassion over judgment. Subscribe to our channel now for more heart-stirring stories that remind us why love is always worth fighting for. Your next emotional journey is waiting. The abandoned Grimsby Mill stood like a monument to forgotten dreams against the pewter sky, its broken windows and sagging roof offering little protection from the February wind that howled across the Yorkshire moors. As Duke Alexander Ashworth's wagon approached the dilapidated building, he could see thin wisps of smoke rising from a makeshift chimney, evidence of the desperate ingenuity that had kept 12 children alive in conditions that would challenge grown men. Timothy Fletcher jumped down from the wagon before it had fully stopped, his young voice calling out in excitement. "It's all right. The Duke's come to help. Lady Isabel told him about us." Alexander descended more slowly, his heart heavy with the weight of impending revelation. He had spent the ride from Ashworth Manor wrestling with his conscience, trying to reconcile the comfortable assumptions of his privileged life with the harsh reality that Timothy had laid bare. Now, faced with the ramshackle shelter that had housed these forgotten souls, he felt the full weight of his moral blindness settling on his shoulders like a lead cloak. The mill's interior was a testament to human resilience and heartbreaking poverty. The children had made their home in what had once been the main grinding room, using old flour sacks and pieces of discarded wood to create partitions that offered the illusion of privacy. A small fire burned in an improvised hearth, built from salvaged bricks, its meager warmth barely taking the edge off the bitter cold that seeped through the building's countless gaps and holes. As Alexander's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw them. 11 pairs of eyes watching him with a mixture of hope and terror that cut straight through to his soul. They ranged in age from tiny Emma, who couldn't have been more than 3, to Robert, who looked to be perhaps 12 or 13. All bore the unmistakable marks of chronic hunger and cold, their faces gaunt and their clothes little more than rags held together by determination and prayer. "Children," Timothy said softly, "here's the Duke, what Lady Isabel works for. He's come to help us, just like she always said he would if he knew about us." A small girl with matted blonde hair and enormous blue eyes stepped forward, her bare feet blue with cold, despite the strips of cloth wrapped around them for protection. "Are you really a duke?" she asked in a voice that held wonder despite her obvious fear. "Lady Isabel said dukes live in castles and eat cake every day." Alexander knelt down so that he was at eye level with the child, his expensive wool coat pooling on the dirt floor. "I am indeed a duke, little one. And what's your name?" "Sarah," she whispered, then added with touching formality, "Sarah Elizabeth, though I don't remember my last name proper. Lady Isabel says it don't matter, that families is made by love, not by names written in books." The simple wisdom of Isabel's teaching hit Alexander like a physical blow. Here, in this place of desperate poverty, she had been building something beautiful, a family bound not by blood or law, but by mutual care and protection. While he had been counting his silver and worrying about social protocols, she had been saving lives with a courage that shamed his own comfortable existence. "Lady Isabel is quite right, Sarah Elizabeth," he said gently. "Family is indeed made by love. Now, I've brought some things that might help make you all more comfortable. Would you like to see?" The transformation that came over the children as his servants began unloading the wagon was nothing short of miraculous. Faces that had been pinched with hunger brightened as they saw wheels of cheese, loaves of fresh bread, and sides of bacon that would provide sustenance for weeks. Warm blankets and proper clothing elicited tears of joy from the older children, who understood exactly what such gifts meant for their survival. But it was the medicines that Dr. Whitmore had sent that brought the most profound relief. Little Emma had been coughing with a deep, wet sound that Alexander recognized as the precursor to the lung fever that had claimed so many of the poor that winter. A boy named Peter had a festering cut on his leg that could easily turn septic without proper treatment. Another child, barely 6 years old, showed signs of the malnutrition that could permanently damage growing minds and bodies. "Your Grace," said a voice from the doorway, and Alexander turned to see Mrs. Henderson entering the mill with an expression of stunned compassion. Behind her came 3 of the manor's housemaids, their arms full of additional supplies and their faces soft with the kind of maternal instinct that knew no boundaries of class or station. "Margaret," Alexander said, using her given name for the first time in their long association, "I need you to see what can be done to make this place more habitable while we arrange something more permanent. These children cannot spend another night in such conditions." The housekeeper's practical eye took in the situation immediately. "The roof needs patching, the windows want proper covering, and they'll need a proper kitchen area if they're to stay fed and healthy. It'll take a day or 2 to get it all sorted, but it can be done." As the adults worked to organize the immediate necessities, Alexander found himself drawn to a corner of the mill where someone had attempted to create a small school area. Pieces of slate and chalk were arranged on an old wooden table, and the walls were decorated with childish drawings that spoke of dreams and aspirations despite their current circumstances. But what captured his attention most completely was a small collection of books, their pages worn soft from countless readings. "Lady Isabel brings us stories," Robert explained, appearing at Alexander's elbow with the quiet grace of a child accustomed to moving unnoticed. She says, reading is the one thing what can't never be taken away from us, no matter how poor we get. Alexander picked up one of the books, a volume of fairy tales that he recognized from his own childhood library. The pages were annotated in Isabel's delicate handwriting, with notes explaining difficult words and historical references that would help these children understand the wider world beyond their makeshift home. "She's teaching you well," he said quietly. "Robert, how long has it been since she last visited?" "3 days now," the boy replied, his young face creased with worry that seemed far too old for his years. "She always comes every other day, regular like clockwork. Timothy heard in the village that something happened to her, that she's in trouble with the law." The trust in Robert's voice, the absolute faith these children had placed in a woman who had risked everything to protect them, crystallized Alexander's resolve. He had wronged Isabel catastrophically, but perhaps it was not too late to make amends. Perhaps he could still prove himself worthy of the faith she had shown in human nature, even when humanity had failed her so completely. "Robert," he said carefully, "how would you and the others feel about coming to live at Ashworth Manor? Properly, with warm beds and regular meals and lessons with a real tutor." The boy's eyes went wide with an emotion that was equal parts hope and disbelief. "You'd do that for us, even though we ain't your responsibility? You became my responsibility the moment Lady Isabel made you hers," Alexander replied with a conviction that surprised him with its intensity. "A wrong has been done, and it's my duty to set it right." As word of the Duke's offer spread through the small group, Alexander saw something beautiful happen. These children, who had every reason to trust no one, chose to believe in the possibility of kindness. They began to gather their few possessions with an excitement tempered by the caution of those who had learned that hope could be a dangerous luxury. But even as he organized the logistics of relocating 12 children to Ashworth Manor, Alexander's mind was focused on a more urgent mission. Somewhere in the village, Isabel sat in a cell, facing a future that would destroy everything she was and everything she might become. She had sacrificed her reputation, her freedom, and very nearly her life to protect these forgotten souls. Now it was his turn to prove that love could triumph over law, that mercy was stronger than judgment. The snow had begun to fall as they loaded the children into wagons warmed with heated stones and wrapped in wool blankets that smelled of lavender and prosperity. As the little procession made its way toward Ashworth Manor, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. The pure, uncomplicated joy of doing the right thing for the right reasons. But his work was far from finished. In a few hours, he would stand before Magistrate Thornfield and demand the immediate release of the woman who had shown him what true nobility looked like. He would expose his own moral failings to the world if necessary, would sacrifice his reputation and social standing to restore hers, because some truths were too important to remain hidden, and some love was too pure to let perish in the darkness of misunderstanding. Lady Isabel Montclair had saved 12 lives with her courage. Now it was Alexander's turn to save the one life that mattered most, hers. The Duke's education in love was finally complete, and his redemption was about to begin. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of discovery, where justice triumphs and love conquers all prejudice. If this story moved you as much as it moved us, please subscribe to our channel for more emotionally captivating tales that celebrate the triumph of the human spirit. Your support helps us bring these unforgettable stories to life, and we can't wait to share our next breathtaking adventure with you. Hit that subscribe button now and let us know in the comments which story of courage and redemption you'd like to experience next.